If you ever get a job offer like this, burn it. I'm not joking. I don't care how much they're paying you, how clean the contract looks, how desperate you are. If it mentions an abandoned town, isolation bonuses, or temporary population discrepancies, you delete the email and pretend you never saw it. Because I'm standing in the dark right now, pressed against the peeling wallpaper of a house that isn't supposed to have anyone in it, listening to something walk across the front porch. It's matching my breathing. Slow inhale, slow exhale, step, step, step. Except the steps are wrong. They're too evenly spaced, too careful, like someone who learned how humans walk by watching from a distance. The town is supposed to be empty. That's what the paperwork said. That's what the satellite images showed. Empty streets, empty homes, infrastructure scheduled for demolition. Empty. But about 30 seconds ago, something dragged its heel across the porch boards outside this living room window. Not shuffled, not stumbled, dragged, like it was testing the sound. I haven't moved since. The house smells like old dust and something faintly metallic. The furniture is still here: couch, lamp, family photos on the wall. A smiling couple frozen mid-1970s. I keep staring at their eyes in the frame, half expecting them to blink. There it is again. Step. Closer now. Right outside the window. The glass trembles slightly, as if something is leaning its weight against the pane. I can hear what should be breathing, but it's not quite synced to lungs. It's copying the rhythm of mine, just a fraction too late. I shouldn't have stayed past sunset. I shouldn't have listened to that voicemail. And I definitely should have listened to the last surveyor's recording. They never told me why he quit. The porch boards creak under a sudden shift of weight. Then silence. The kind that presses against your ears until you start hearing things that might not exist. My phone has no signal. The truck's 2 street. Over. And whatever is outside just whispered something that sounded almost like my name. Except it didn't pronounce it right. There's a soft knock on the glass. Polite. Curious. Like a neighbor checking in. I finally understand the first mistake I made. The town wasn't abandoned. It was waiting. 3 days earlier. 3 days earlier, I was sitting in my apartment staring at an eviction notice taped crookedly to my front door. Freelance land surveying sounds stable when you explain it at parties. Environmental assessment. Boundary verification. Soil analysis. It sounds technical, grounded, predictable. It isn't. It's contract to contract. Gig to gig. One delayed payment away from selling your equipment to make rent. I just finished a wetland delineation job that paid half of what was promised and took twice as long. My savings were gone. My credit card was screaming. I was calculating how long I could live off ramen without developing scurvy. That's when the email came in. Subject line: Rural Site Assessment, Immediate Availability, Premium Rate. Premium was an understatement. The pay was nearly triple my usual fee for a 3-day evaluation. All I had to do was survey and document structural conditions in an abandoned mining town scheduled for demolition. Verify environmental hazards. Confirm vacancy. Confirm vacancy. The town had been empty since the late 70s, according to the brief. Population decline. Mine closure. Gradual relocation. Standard rural decay. I should have asked why demolition was happening now, after nearly 50 years. Instead, I clicked reply. The company name was one I didn't recognize. Their website looked legitimate in that sterile, corporate template way. No staff photos. No project history older than 5 years. Just words like asset management and reclamation strategy. They called within the hour. The recruiter's voice was calm, professional, almost rehearsed. Mr. Halpern, we reviewed your portfolio. Your experience with structural and environmental crossover assessments makes you ideal. Appreciate that, I said. What's the catch? A small pause. Paper shuffling. No catch. The site is remote. We offer a hardship bonus for inconvenience. How remote? Limited cellular reception. Limited as in spotty, or limited as in non-existent? Another pause. You should assume non-existent. I hesitated. Anyone else on site, you'll be working independently. Security unnecessary. Maintenance crew no. Residents. The line went quiet enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. Mr. Halpern, she said carefully, the town is uninhabited. Uninhabited. Not abandoned. Not empty. Uninhabited. She continued before I could press further. We've had trouble retaining surveyors due to environmental discomfort. Environmental discomfort. Wildlife interference. Structural instability. Rural isolation can be psychologically taxing. How many surveyors? A faint exhale. A few. That wasn't an answer. She emailed the contract while we were still on the phone. It was dense, restrictive, multiple clauses about liability, data ownership, non-disclosure. One line in particular stood out. Contractor agrees not to remain on-site past sunset due to safety liability. Sunset? I asked. Visibility concerns, she replied smoothly. We prefer all assessments occur during daylight hours. Why liability? It was always liability. I skimmed further. If signs of occupancy are discovered, document and withdraw. Occupancy. I repeated. Her voice didn't change, but something tightened beneath it. If you see signs of occupancy, you log it. But you don't engage. I laughed lightly. You're telling me not to knock on doors in a ghost town a beat. Yes. The silence that followed felt less like poor reception and more like restraint. I signed anyway. Money has a way of sanding down your instincts. 2 days later, I loaded my truck with equipment: tripod, laser rangefinder, drone kit, environmental testing supplies, and started the drive out of the city. The highway thinned from 4 lanes to 2. Buildings gave way to scrubland and long stretches of empty fencing. About an hour from the coordinates they'd sent, my phone lost signal completely. No bars. No emergency access. Just a hollow little icon. I turned on the radio to fill the silence. Static. I adjusted the dial. Found a country station for about 30 seconds before the audio began to warp, stretching vowels into something almost melodic, almost like overlapping voices trying to sync. Then the signal dissolved into a low, rhythmic hiss. It sounded strangely like breathing. I told myself it was just bad reception. Up ahead, beyond a bend in the road, I saw the first rusted welcome sign half swallowed by weeds. The town's name had faded almost completely, like it was trying to forget itself. The road into town narrowed until it felt less like an entrance and more like a funnel. Weeds pushed through cracks in the asphalt, brushing the underside of my truck. The welcome sign leaned at an angle, its paint sun-bleached into anonymity. Whatever the town had once been called was now just a faint outline of letters, like something half erased from memory. I expected decay. I expected rot, collapsed roofs, graffiti layered over decades of neglect. Instead, I found preservation. The main street stretched ahead in a straight line, flanked by low brick storefronts with wide glass windows. The glass wasn't shattered. It wasn't even cracked. Dusty, yes, but intact. A hardware store still displayed rakes and shovels in its front window. A clothing boutique had mannequins posed mid-step, polyester dresses faded but upright, their painted smiles stiff and unwavering. It looked less like a ghost town and more like someone had pressed pause. Cars were still parked along the curb. A wood-paneled station wagon. A dented pickup with a cracked windshield but no rust bloom. The tires were flat, but not shredded. Doors closed. Keys nowhere visible. I parked near what looked like the old diner and stepped out. The air felt still in a way that didn't match the open sky. No wind. No insects. Even the usual hum of distant wildlife was absent. Just quiet. A thick, insulated quiet. I opened the diner door. The bell above it didn't ring. Inside, sunlight filtered through the front windows, illuminating booths lined with red vinyl. Plates sat on tables, some with utensils neatly placed beside them. One still had a hardened smear of something that might have been eggs. There were no overturned chairs. No signs of panic. No broken glass. No hurried abandonment. Behind the counter, a coffee pot sat on a warmer that had long since gone cold. A receipt book lay open to a page dated mid-June, 1978. I walked deeper inside, boots stirring up a thin layer of dust. It wasn't thick enough. That was the first thing that bothered me. After nearly 50 years, there should have been inches of it. Cobwebs draped from every corner. Instead, there was only a fine coating, like the place had been cleaned once and then left alone for a year. Maybe 2. I stepped into a nearby house after finishing my initial exterior notes. Same story. couch still positioned toward a bulky television set. The TV was unplugged, cord neatly coiled. A thin veil of dust coated the screen. On the wall, a calendar hung open to September 1978. The days stopped mid-month. No circles, no frantic markings, just a square around the 14th in blue pen. I moved down the hallway, peering into bedrooms where beds were made, closets half full. A pair of shoes rested beside one bed, as if their owner planned to slip into them the next morning. No signs of evacuation. No luggage dragged out in a rush. No broken frames. No looting. It was too untouched. People don't leave like this. I muttered to myself, the sound of my voice startling in the silence. I stepped back into the living room and noticed something on the hardwood floor. Footprints. Clear impressions in the dust, leading from the front door toward the hallway. Not old. The edges were crisp, defined. I crouched beside them, pulse ticking up. The tread pattern was modern rubber sole, crosshatch design. Definitely not 70s era. I followed the trail with my eyes. They ended abruptly in the center of the hallway. No return prints. No continuation. Just stop. I straightened slowly. Wind, I said under my breath. Has to be wind. The windows were closed. The air was still. I forced a short laugh. Maybe I tracked them in, but I knew I hadn't. To shake the feeling crawling up my spine, I walked back outside and crossed to the neighboring house. The porch boards creaked under my weight, loud in the emptiness. I knocked on the front door, just to prove a point to myself. Hello, I called, half smiling at my own theatrics. The knock echoed inside the house. Then a knock answered from the other side. Same rhythm, same force. I froze, hands still raised. Silence settled so quickly it felt staged. I stared at the door, waiting for movement, for a shadow under the crack, for anything. Nothing. After a full 30 seconds, I stepped back, heart thudding harder than I wanted to admit. Old pipes, I whispered. Wood shifting, but the door hadn't rattled. It hadn't vibrated. It had responded. I moved down the street more carefully after that, taking photos, jotting notes, trying to reframe what I'd experienced as coincidence. That's when I saw the municipal building at the end of the block. Unlike the others, its windows were tinted darker. The front doors were locked with a heavy chain and padlock that looked newer than anything else in town. A faded placard hung beside the entrance. Town administration below it, a smaller metal sign screwed into the door read, Records Population Reconciliation Reconciliation. The word felt bureaucratic, harmless, but it didn't belong in a place like this. I stepped closer to the glass, trying to peer inside. Something shifted in the reflection behind me. I turned. The street was empty. When I looked back at the door, my own reflection seemed slightly out of place, like it had taken half a second too long to mirror me. I told myself it was just the angle of the sun. By the time I checked my watch, it was later than it should have been. The sky was already beginning to dim. Night was falling faster than expected. I decided not to risk sleeping inside one of the houses. Call it instinct. Call it pride. I told myself it was professionalism. I didn't want to disturb potential structural evidence before documenting it properly. The truth was simpler. I didn't trust the silence inside those walls. So I parked my truck along the main street, angled toward the road out of town. Just in case. The sky bled from orange to bruised purple faster than it should have. By the time I finished logging exterior notes and setting up my equipment for the morning, darkness had pooled between the buildings like standing water. I locked the doors, checked them twice. At 8:59 p.m., I was mid-sentence in a voice memo about foundation erosion when the first streetlight flickered. I glanced up. The bulb buzzed faintly, then steadied into a pale yellow glow. I checked my watch. 9 p.m. exactly. One by one, in perfect sequence, the streetlights lining the road blinked on. Not randomly, not erratically, sequentially. Left side first, then right, like a system booting up. That's not possible, I muttered. I'd already inspected the outskirts earlier. The transformer station sat behind a chain-link fence near the edge of town. Rusted, panels hanging open. No hum, no vibration, no active lines feeding in from anywhere I could see. The grid was dead, and yet the town was lighting itself. As if on cue, porch lights began to glow. house by house, soft halos illuminating doorframes, casting long shadows across unmoving yards. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't malfunctioning. It was deliberate. I stepped out of the truck long enough to take a few photos, scanning for generators, solar rigs, any logical explanation. There was nothing. Just quiet houses bathing in artificial light. No power source visible. I whispered into my recorder. Streetlights active at 2100 hours. Likely residual grid charge or a screen door slammed somewhere down the block. I flinched. The sound echoed sharply, then dissolved into stillness. No wind stirred the trees. The air hung heavy and unmoving. A few seconds later, I heard laughter. Faint, distant, not the manic kind. Not horror movie hysteria. Casual laughter. The kind that drifts from a backyard barbecue or an open living room window. I stepped slowly onto the pavement, heart picking up speed. "Hello," I called out, hating how small my voice sounded. Silence. Then, clearer this time, Mom, a child's voice. "Hi." Curious. Close enough that it felt like it came from the house directly across from me. I stared at the dark windows. Mom, the word echoed slightly, like it was being repeated in a hallway too long for the sound. "There's no one here," I whispered to myself. Auditory carryover. Wildlife. Wildlife doesn't say Mom. I forced myself back into the truck and locked the doors again, hands shaking just enough to irritate me. At 9:30 p.m., I drove to the transformer station with my high-beam flashlight cutting through the dark. The station was as dead as before. No vibration under my palm when I touched the metal casing. No ozone smell. No heat. I stood there for a long moment, listening. Nothing. When I returned to the main street, the lights were still on. Waiting. By 11 p.m., the town had settled into a rhythm. Occasional soft thuds from inside houses. The faint creak of what might have been floorboards adjusting. Once, the distinct sound of a chair scraping across wood. Every time I whipped my head toward the noise, the windows remained empty. Blank. Reflective. I kept talking into the recorder to fill the space. Note to self, I murmured around 11:10, forcing a dry chuckle. Charge extra for haunted. Infrastructure. My laugh died quickly. At exactly 11:17 p.m., every light in town shut off. Not flickered. Not dimmed. Off. Instantly. The darkness that swallowed the street felt physical, like a curtain dropped over my eyes. I sucked in a breath and fumbled for my flashlight, but before I could click it on, one porch light across from me blinked back to life. Just one. The house directly opposite my truck. The glow illuminated lace curtains in the front window. They shifted. Not fluttered. Shifted. Pulled aside slightly from within. I froze, staring at the thin gap in the fabric. Something moved behind it. A shape. Human height. Standing too still. "Okay." I whispered into the recorder, my voice barely audible. "Single light source active. Possible trespasser." The words sounded ridiculous even as I said it. I reached for my drone case with slow, careful movements, never taking my eyes off the window. If someone was in there, I'd get aerial footage. Proof. Context. My hands felt numb as I launched it. The drone rose with a soft whir, climbing above the rooftops. I switched to live feed on my tablet. From above, the town looked different. Occupied. Through multiple windows, houses up and down the street, I could see movement. Shadows pacing inside living rooms. Figures standing near kitchen tables. One silhouette leaned close to a window 2 houses down, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. My stomach dropped. I lowered the drone slightly, angling for a clearer view of the house across from me, the one with the single porch light. The curtain snapped fully open. The room inside was empty. No furniture. No figure. Nothing. I glanced up from the tablet to the actual house. The curtain was closed again. Still, I checked the live feed. The figures in the other houses were still there. Moving. I slowly lowered the drone back toward the truck, pulse hammering in my ears. As it descended, I realized something worse. On the tablet screen, in the reflection of my truck's rear window, there was a shape standing directly behind the vehicle. I turned around in my seat. Before I could see anything through the darkness, something tapped gently on the driver's side window. From behind me, morning came too quickly. Morning arrived like nothing had happened. Sunlight streamed through the windshield, warm and ordinary. Birds chirped somewhere beyond the rooftops. The air carried that dry, dusty scent of open land baking under early heat. For a few fragile minutes, I almost convinced myself the night had been a stress-induced hallucination. The streetlights were off. The porch lights were dark. Every house looked as lifeless and preserved as it had the afternoon before. No figures in windows. No curtains shifting. My truck's exterior showed no fingerprints. No dents. No signs that anything had tapped on the glass. I stepped out slowly, scanning the street. Empty. Rationality crept back in with the daylight. Electrical surge from an old backup system. Wildlife noises distorted by acoustics. Drone interference causing visual artifacts. Stress plus isolation equals imagination. That's what I told myself as I walked back toward the municipal building. The chain and padlock on the front doors looked newer than anything else in town. Someone had secured this place long after the residents left. I hesitated only a moment before retrieving bolt cutters from my truck. The metal snapped with a sharp crack that echoed down the street. I waited, half expecting something to answer. Nothing did. Inside, the air was cooler. Stale but undisturbed. Filing cabinets lined the walls behind a reception counter. A directory sign pointed toward offices and, at the end of a narrow hallway, a door labeled Records Population Reconciliation. The phrase unsettled me more in daylight than it had before. The records room door was locked, but the mechanism was older. Easier. It gave way after a few minutes of effort. The room beyond was lined with metal shelves packed tightly, with boxes and binders. Dust coated everything evenly here, thicker than in the houses, as if this was the one place no one had touched in decades. I pulled the nearest binder from a shelf labeled census data. Typed sheets, handwritten annotations, photographs paper-clipped to certain pages. Last official population count, 312. The date matched the calendar I'd seen in the house. September 1978. I flipped through birth records, death certificates, marriage licenses, all meticulously documented up until mid-month. Then nothing. No spike in mortality. No evacuation order. No relocation filings. No disaster report. The final page in the binder was a typed document stamped with a municipal seal. Population reconciliation complete. That was it. No explanation beneath it. No signatures except for the mayor's. Reconciliation with what I opened another box labeled correspondence. Inside were letters, some typed, some handwritten, addressed to town officials. One read, "I've noticed my neighbor repeating the same conversation 3 days in a row. Word for word. At first I thought I was misremembering, but my wife heard it too." Another, "There are people standing in their yards at night. Not talking, not moving, just facing the street." A third, "My son says I've been asking him the same question every morning. I don't remember doing that. Please advise." My pulse quickened as I read faster. My husband came home from work yesterday and didn't seem to recognize the kitchen. He stood there for 10 minutes, just staring at the sink. There are more of them at night. They're out of sync. The handwriting grew shakier in the later letters. Margins filled with frantic notes. Repeated phrases circled over and over. At the bottom of the final envelope, folded separately, was a single sheet of paper bearing the mayor's letterhead. It wasn't addressed to anyone, just written, "If you're reading this, don't let them finish counting you." I stared at that sentence for a long time. Then I returned to the census binder. Each of the 312 names was listed in neat columns. But someone had gone through and drawn a thin red line through 311 of them. One by one, every name crossed out, except one. The final line at the bottom of the page was blank. No name written. Just an empty space where one should have been. I felt a cold prickle spread across my shoulders. 311 crossed out. One unaccounted for. 312 total. I flipped back to the cover sheet. Population, 312. Reconciliation complete. Behind me, somewhere above the ceiling, a floorboard creaked. Slow, deliberate, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving across the second floor. The footsteps upstairs didn't rush. They paced, heel to toe, even spacing, crossing from one side of the municipal building to the other, then back again, as if following a memorized route. I stood frozen between metal shelves, gripping the census binder so tightly the edge bit into my palm. "Hello," I called, immediately regretting it. The pacing stopped. Silence poured down from the ceiling. Then Daniel, my heart nearly stopped. It was my voice. Not similar. Not close. Mine. Same pitch. Same rasp at the edge of the second syllable. Daniel, it called again from upstairs, slightly offbeat, like an echo that had lost its timing. I backed toward the records room door, every instinct screaming at me to get outside. "That's not possible," I muttered. A third time, closer now, just beyond the doorway in the hall. "Daniel." The way I say it when I'm testing audio levels. Flat. Impersonal. I bolted out of the records room and into the sunlight, lungs burning. The street hit me like a splash of cold water, bright. Open, empty. Empty. I doubled over, hands on my knees, trying to steady my breathing. "Okay," I whispered. "Okay." Stress response. Auditory hallucination. My voice sounded small out there. I pulled out my field recorder with shaking fingers. If I'd left it running upstairs, maybe it picked up something. Useful. Something explainable. I rewound to just before I'd heard my name. The playback crackled softly. Footsteps above. My own voice from minutes earlier, reading aloud. Population 312. Reconciliation complete. A pause. Then, faint but clear, population 312. It was my voice again, but stretched slightly, vowels drawn too long. I scrubbed forward. Another segment from yesterday afternoon played me inside the house, crouched by the footprints. Wind. Has to be wind. Silence. Then, layered over the recording, wind. Has to be wind. Distorted. Flattened. As if the cadence had been copied but not understood. My throat tightened. It wasn't responding in real time. It was replaying me. Learning. I slowly lowered the recorder and looked up and down the street. At first, nothing moved. Then, at the far end near the diner, I saw someone step out of a doorway. A man-shaped figure. He walked to the curb, paused, turned, and walked back inside. 30 seconds later, he did it again. Same pace. Same angle of turn. Same pause. A loop. Across the street, through a front window, I saw a woman-shaped silhouette move from kitchen to hallway. Stop. Turn. Repeat. Like routines burned into muscle memory. The town wasn't empty. It was reenacting. I took a cautious step forward. The figure at the diner doorway paused mid-route. Slowly, too slowly, it turned its head toward me. The movement wasn't fluid. It segmented, like frames skipped in a video. Its face, there was a face, but it didn't sit right. The features were arranged correctly: eyes, nose, mouth, but they lacked depth, like someone had pressed them into place without understanding proportion. The eyes didn't blink. The mouth hung slightly open, unmoving. It stared at me, studying. Then it spoke. "Wind. Has to be wind." The words left its mouth in my exact tone, but the lips didn't quite match the syllables. The sound lagged half a second behind the movement. Cold realization seeped through me. This wasn't a haunting. There were no angry spirits. No trapped souls replaying their final moments. This was replication. The letters in the records room weren't exaggerations. The neighbors weren't imagining it. Something here had learned them. It had observed daily routines, conversations, mannerisms, and when the originals were gone, it filled the gaps. That's what reconciliation meant. Not evacuation. Replacement. I staggered back toward the municipal building, mind racing. If it was counting, if it needed exact numbers. I burst back into the records room and flipped open the census binder again. 311 names crossed out in red. I scanned the final blank line. It wasn't blank anymore. Faint, barely visible, but written in pencil across the empty space, Daniel Halpern, my full name, in handwriting that looked like it had been traced from my driver's license. The pencil strokes were light, hesitant, as if whoever or whatever had written it was still practicing. Behind me, the pacing upstairs resumed. Heel to toe, heel to toe. From somewhere out on the street, I heard another voice join in. Daniel, then another, slightly delayed. Daniel. Layered. Stacking. Testing. My phone vibrated violently in my pocket, nearly making me drop the binder. I fumbled it out. One bar of signal flickered at the top of the screen. A missed call notification. Unknown number. New voicemail. My hands trembled as I pressed play. The recruiter's voice filled my ear, calm but stripped of its earlier warmth. "You weren't supposed to stay overnight," she said. A pause. Then, quieter. "It's more active after dark." I left the municipal building with the census binder still open in my mind. My name. In pencil. Practiced. Incomplete. If the town was copying, it needed material. Patterns. Samples. And I'd just given it 2 days' worth. I needed to know what happened to the last surveyor. The contract paperwork listed lodging at the old Sunset Motel on the edge of town, though I'd chosen to sleep in my truck. Liability clause. Sunset warning. Now it felt less like legal precaution and more like instruction. The motel sat behind a sagging neon sign that hadn't lit in decades. The office door creaked open easily. Inside, the air was thicker than the houses less disturbed. The counter still held a brass bell and a laminated rate sheet from 1977. I moved behind the desk and found the guest registry ledger lying open. The last official entry was dated September 16, 1978. After that, several pages had been torn out. Near the back of the book, tucked between blank sheets, was a more recent page. Different ink, different handwriting. Name, Mark Ellison. Check-in date, 6 months ago. No checkout. My pulse quickened. I recognized the name from the contract email chain. The previous surveyor who had declined to continue services. Declined. I scanned lower on the page. Beneath his name, another line. Already filled in. Daniel Halpern. Check-in date, today's date. The ink looked dry. Settled. Not fresh. I hadn't written that. I stepped back from the desk as if it might bite. Something creaked behind me. I turned slowly. One of the motel room doors at the end of the walkway stood slightly ajar. I hadn't noticed that before. Drawn by something between dread and necessity, I approached it. The room inside was sparse but intact, bed made, curtains drawn halfway, a layer of dust disturbed only near the foot of the bed. The floorboard there looked slightly warped. I crouched and pried it up with the edge of my multi-tool. Beneath it, wrapped in a plastic evidence bag like someone had tried to protect it from moisture, was a handheld recorder. Old model. Scratched casing. I swallowed and pressed play. Static. Then a man's voice, tight with exhaustion. Day 1. Town's intact. 2 intact. A click. Day 2. Census numbers don't line up. I count 311 structures, but records say 312 residents. Feels like something's off by 1. Breathing. Uneven. Buildings shift. Not dramatically, just inches. Doorways don't align the same way in the morning. Thought I was losing it. Another click. Reflections move late. I wave, and it waves back half a second after. My skin prickled. Final entry. His voice was hoarse now. It's not empty. It's understaffed. A long pause. I think they send us to. The recording erupted into scraping, heavy breathing, then a scream cut short mid-breath. Silence. I lowered the recorder slowly. Understaffed. The word echoed in my head alongside reconciliation. Corporate assessment. Environmental survey. Or inventory management. They knew. They had to know. The high pay. The isolation. The clause about sunset. If the town needed numbers balanced, if it needed roles filled where we audits or offerings containment would imply control. Appeasement implied something worse. I stepped back into the motel office and stared again at the registry. Mark Ellison. No checkout. My name already inked beneath his. Outside, the air shifted. A low hum rolled across town, subtle but unmistakable. Mid-afternoon, and somewhere down the streetlights flickered back to life. The hum thickened into a vibration under my boots. Then, from somewhere near the center of town, a loudspeaker crackled to life. The sound was old, grainy, distorted by age but powered. Deliberate. A tone blared once. Flat. Mechanical. Then a voice followed. Not human. Not quite synthetic either. Population reconciliation incomplete. The words echoed down Main Street, bouncing off brick and glass. Incomplete. My stomach dropped. From the diner doorway, the man-shaped figure stepped out again. But this time, he didn't repeat his loop. He walked forward. Across the street, the woman-shaped silhouette emerged from her house. Doors opened up and down the block. Not slamming, not bursting, opening. One by one, figures stepped into the daylight. They didn't rush. They didn't lurch. They walked calmly to the street and stopped at evenly spaced intervals, forming a loose grid along the pavement. Faces turned toward me. Too still, too symmetrical. Population reconciliation incomplete, the loudspeaker repeated. I backed away slowly, turning in a circle as more figures emerged behind me. They filled the sidewalks, stood at driveways, occupied porches, all facing inward, toward the center, toward me. There had been 311 names crossed out. One blank line. They weren't hunting. They were arranging. They need one more, I whispered, the realization settling like ice in my veins. 311 copies. One vacancy. Me. The loudspeaker crackled again. Finalized count. The figures took a synchronized step forward. Not aggressive, just precise. I ran. Instinct finally overpowering analysis. I sprinted toward the road out of town, boots slamming against asphalt. My truck was only 2 blocks away. Except the block didn't end. The street stretched longer than it had before. Buildings repeating in patterns too familiar. The hardware store appeared twice. Then 3 times. My lungs burned. I charge extra for overtime. I gasped to no one. The joke brittle and desperate. Behind me, footsteps multiplied. Not pounding. Measured. Hundreds of them, evenly spaced. I fumbled for my tablet as I ran, activating the drone feed without stopping. The device was still perched near the motel roof. The screen flickered to life. Aerial view. The town below looked symmetrical from above, streets forming a near-perfect grid. Figures dotted the pavement in careful intervals. And at the center of the formation there I was, standing still, head tilted slightly upward. Not running, not breathing hard, just standing among them. I nearly tripped. I looked down at myself, my hands pumping, chest heaving. Then back to the screen. The version of me on the tablet raised its head in perfect sync with my glance. Its movements were smoother than mine, more certain. Population reconciliation incomplete, the loudspeaker intoned again. The figures tightened their spacing, closing gaps, correcting alignment. I veered into what should have been a side street. It curved instead of running straight. The diner sign loomed ahead again, though I'd already passed it. The grid was folding inward. A hand clamped around my forearm. I screamed and twisted, expecting something cold. The grip was firm, warm, human warm. I looked down slowly. The hand gripping me was mine. Same scar across the knuckle from a college accident. Same dirt under the fingernails. I followed the arm upward. My face stared back at me. Expression neutral. Eyes unblinking. Wind, it said softly in my voice. Has to be wind. For half a second, I couldn't move. My own face stared back at me from inches away, skin slightly too smooth, eyes a shade too flat, mouth hovering at the edge of a smile it hadn't earned. Wind, it repeated gently. Has to be wind. Its grip tightened. Warm. Solid. Calloused in the same places as mine. Rage snapped something loose inside me. I'm not inventory. I hissed and drove my forehead forward. Our skulls collided with a sickening crack. Pain exploded behind my eyes. The grip faltered. That was enough. I wrenched my arm free and shoved the thing backward. It stumbled not clumsily, but as if recalibrating balance. The surrounding figures paused, heads tilting in eerie unison. The loudspeaker screeched. Error. I ran. This time the street shifted under my feet again, storefronts duplicating and sliding sideways, but I didn't look at them. I focused on the memory of where my truck had been parked. Second block past the diner. Left side, angled toward the exit. I cut through a yard instead of following the road. The grass felt wrong under my boots. Too uniform, like carpet. Hands brushed at my sleeves as I passed between figures. Not grabbing, just grazing, measuring. Finalized, the loudspeaker began again. I burst onto the main road. My truck sat exactly where I'd left it. Untouched. I didn't question it. I dove inside, slammed the door, and jammed the key into the ignition. For one nauseating second, nothing happened. Then the engine roared to life. The figures didn't chase. They stepped back into their evenly spaced positions, forming a corridor down the center of the street. Watching, as I drove between them, their heads turned in perfect synchronization as I passed. Every face identical in stillness, every mouth slightly open, counting. I didn't look in the mirrors until I cleared the welcome sign at the edge of town. The moment my tires hit the open highway, the air seemed to thin. My ears popped like I'd changed altitude. The hum vanished. In the rearview mirror, the town was still there for a split second. Brick buildings, silent figures lining the road. Then the landscape bent subtly, like heat distortion. And it was gone. Just empty scrubland stretching behind me. No sign. No buildings. No side road. My phone buzzed violently against the dashboard. Full bars. LTE. Notifications flooded in, missed emails, weather alerts, a text from my landlord. The screen lit up with an incoming call. Unknown number. I answered without thinking. Daniel, the recruiter's voice said, smooth as ever. Survey complete. I opened my mouth. Thought about the census binder. The blank line. The pencil. Yeah, I said finally. My voice sounded distant to my own ears. It's done. A pause. Paper shuffling on her end. Good, she replied. Population reconciled. The words slid through me like cold water. You knew? I started. But the line had already gone dead. No goodbye. No click. Just silence. I let out a shaky breath and forced myself to focus on the road. Mile markers passed. Civilized infrastructure returned, billboards, exit signs, distant radio towers. Normalcy. I almost laughed. Almost. At the next stretch of straight highway, I adjusted my rearview mirror, just to reassure myself. The back seat was empty until it wasn't. Someone was sitting directly behind me, perfectly upright, hands folded in their lap, wearing my face. I'm recording this from my apartment. 3 days since I left the highway. 3 days since I checked the back seat and saw my own face staring at me. You're probably wondering how I'm still here. So am I. The drive after that is a blur. I remember blinking and the back seat was empty again. No imprint on the fabric. No reflection in the window. Just me, alone, hands welded to the steering wheel. I told myself it had been shock, sleep deprivation, a stress fracture in perception. I made it home, and for a few hours, everything felt normal. That's the worst part. Normality isn't safety. It's camouflage. The first thing I noticed was my neighbor across the hall, Mrs. Alvarez. Sweet woman. Talks too much about her cats. Yesterday morning, she caught me by the mailbox. Long trip? She asked. Yeah, I said. Work. She smiled. Well, welcome back. An hour later, I passed her again in the hallway. Long trip? She asked. Same tone. Same inflection. Yeah, I said slowly. Work. Well, welcome back. Word for word. I waited for a flicker of recognition. There was none. Last night at exactly 9 p.m., the streetlights outside my apartment building flicked on. That isn't unusual. Except they've never all activated at the exact same millisecond before. Not in perfect sync. I stood at the window and counted under my breath. 1, 2, 3. Every light in view hummed softly, identical in brightness. At 11:17 p.m., they shut off. Simultaneously. I didn't sleep after that. This morning, while brushing my teeth, I tested something. I raised my hand in the mirror. My reflection followed. Half a second late. Just enough to notice. I didn't lower my hand right away. Neither did it. It watched me, learning. I pulled up the scanned images of the census binder on my laptop an hour ago. I'd taken photos for documentation. Proof. Insurance. I opened the final page. Population, 312. 311 names crossed out. One line. Filled in faint pencil. Daniel Halpern. But that's not what made my throat close. At the bottom of the scanned document, beneath the original total, another number had been typed in clean, digital font. Population, 313. I checked the file metadata. The image hadn't been altered on my device, which means the alteration wasn't digital. It was conceptual. It was counting in real time. I wasn't meant to leave empty-handed. I was meant to carry something back. Information, observation, exposure. It doesn't just copy bodies. It copies patterns, routines, voices, and the more you document it, the clearer the sample becomes. You're probably thinking this is paranoia, stress, a man unraveling after too much isolation. I hope that's what it is. But if you've listened this far, if you've followed every detail, imagined every streetlight flicker, pictured every face standing evenly spaced along that road, then you've participated. You've visualized it, counted it, reinforced the pattern. Have your streetlights ever switched on in perfect sync? Have you ever heard someone repeat your exact words back to you, slightly offbeat? Have you ever caught your reflection correcting itself? The town isn't confined to geography. It's a system, a grid, a template waiting to be filled. Reconciliation isn't about a place. It's about numbers balancing. I don't know if the company is containing it or distributing it. I don't know if Mark Ellison ever made it home. I don't know if the thing that sat behind me on the highway stepped out when I blinked, or if it's still here, just out of frame. What I do know is this. Every time someone hears this story, the total changes. If someone knocks tonight, don't answer. It might just be the town trying to balance the numbers.